Okay, so this is where this black and white study is. And so I got the blocking in done on top of the watercolor. Then I got a chance to paint the shadows during blocking in. Then came in with the middle values. So everything was a little bit dark. So I've moved everything a little bit closer. And then I stepped away from it so that I can kind of reevaluate it. Now I'm taking a look at how values are. So I'm just picking up a little bit of darkness in the occlusion to see, kind of relatively speaking, how the dark forms are working with the rest of the composition. And I think that amount of darkness is about right. So there's going to be an occlusion that's underneath there, and then it moves into a dark gray, but not quite as dark as the occlusion through here. So you can see that's not quite as dark as the occlusion. Okay, so I'm just looking at how light and dark colors are. Okay, that's about right. They said if you work pretty quickly, the paint will reward you with some pretty interesting marks. It will give you a lot more freedom. If you work slowly, it can look a little, a little tedious, a little less exciting.
But it all comes out in the end. Meaning, 20 years practice, it's all easy. I'll probably have to edit that out.
Okay, so I'm looking at things that are kind of subtle, like the very subtle change in value right there. I'm making it a tiny bit more explicit because it's just more interesting. The way this shadow becomes a little more open as it moves away. That's because these gradations that happen in here are more interesting than flat color. And in particular, that's true in the background. It doesn't mean you need hard edges. Sometimes hard edges are a little distracting. So throwing in another color in there kind of cuts down on those hard edges. So I don't know if you noticed, but so I put down that dark color first and then let it set up for a minute before working back into it with the next lighter color. Just seemed like a good idea. I'm gonna have to give you guys music or something on this one because honestly, when I'm painting, I'm not very talkative. It's very hard to talk and paint. See, so some of the things that I'm looking at, I softened that line, the light line that comes down there. The shadow of this bag hits somewhere in here, so I'm softening that edge so it isn't quite so glowing light. Nice. So it isn't glowing quite so much. Trying to get a feel for where that shadow would hit. and cleaning up and repairing the edges that are around the line, like right in here. Just a little bit. Doesn't need much. So the edges around the apple are better. Now I need to look at the reflection on the apple, but I'm going to let the paint around it set up a little bit. So we're going to look at another occlusion. So I'm mixing up a color that's not quite black. There's very little black and very little white. In reality, white would be like staring into the sun or whatever the brightest light source is. And an awful lot of students, like one of the things I'm noticing is a lot of people are not using overlap and painting objects where you can see the whole object. Just in reality, that doesn't happen all that often. It's hard to see the entire object. So a little bit of overlap makes things a lot more interesting, in my opinion. And I think if you look around, when you set up a still life, it's cool that it feels arranged and thoughtful, but it shouldn't feel fake. And that's kind of a fine line, right? So somewhere between planned and set up in a boring kind of way is kind of delicate headspace. But I think it's worth investigating, worth giving some thought to. Okay, so I've still got some of the underpainting showing through in these areas. I'm just softening that up a little bit and getting another coat of paint. Pretty much everything needs 2 coats of paint. And the nice thing is, the second time you paint it, you tend to be more confident. Like as you go across over the painting, you tend to be a little bit more confident because you've already solved these problems once. And you know you can. You know it's all going to work out just fine. And it is. Okay, then I've got reflected light through here. There's a little light coming up on the bag. Through this edge. I don't know if it's quite that bright. But we also know that that's going to get a little darker, right, as the paint dries. So things that look very dramatic and kind of, oh my gosh, what do you think you're doing, can become pretty subtle pretty quickly. Just important not to panic. Telling you, the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, it looks more prophetic all the time. Just don't panic. But while the paint's wet, see, even things like that, don't panic. If it was a good idea the first time, it's an even better idea the second time. So when you come back to touch something up, you might make it better. But regardless, you're unlikely to make it any worse. Because you're kind of systematically raising your standards while you're working. So the shadow on this apple follows kind of a shape like that. Yeah. And you can see what I'm doing is I'm leaning in, so one edge of the mark is a little bit harder than the other end, or the other edge of the mark. So what I'm going to do is dragging the lower part of that mark through the paint and letting the upper end be in the air. That way I can create hard and soft edges with one mark. It takes a little bit of practice, but not really too tough. So that means that like through there, so all I'm doing is drawing with one corner on the surface.
Too light.
So one is for the edge of the apple to be kind of magically, mysteriously lost. I don't need it to be a really clean, easy to find edge. And I want everything to kind of move down toward a little point where the paper meets that. So right in there should be the kind of a little arrow that points in that direction. I'll show you why in a sec. So this reflection, you can see is closest there. So when I paint the light in, I want it to reflect mostly right there. And these slightly bolder marks that you can make as you're working really help to kind of break things up in an interesting way. So you can see that there are some sharper edges, some more interesting things going on within there. It's not all just a flat, simple form, which makes it a lot more interesting, makes it more fun. And a few bold marks. Right, so instead of using the dry brush all the time, a few bold marks on the surface, which can always be softened and amended. A few bold marks really help. All right, let's see what else is going on. Oh, the background, we talked about darkening the background. Now that we've established that we've got almost black down there, what I can do is we want to enhance a little bit of the darkness. So I'm gonna, also I wanted this tabletop to continue. Can't really determine where it goes though. Guess I should do that. I told you I'd show you several ways to blend, and I'll do that. So one of the things you can do for blending, it's kind of interesting. We talked about how I'm just dragging the brush very lightly over the surface, so that's using a dry brush to blend, meaning that I'm not actually blending the paint, I'm just dragging dry paint over wet paint. Or wet paint over dry paint. Kind of depends. One is more scumbling than dry brush. If you guys are going, but wait, that's, that looked pretty good. It's like, yeah, it does look okay, but if I can do it well once, I can do it better the next time. I really believe that. So I try not to settle for it looks pretty good. I want to make it look the best I can. And so even though that's a pretty small change, just that little bit of darkening as it goes back, and then dragging a few more random marks across there. Although certainly not completely random, but getting a few of those marks and cleaning up any edges that are distracting. So anything that bothers me, I want to fix it. And I don't know if you can see, because you're looking at the film of it, but that's a more interesting surface. So putting more paint down. One of the great things about acrylics, and I mean genuinely a great thing about it, is that it dries so fast. I mean, that's okay. So let's since we got an opportunity, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to spray a little water there. Just a little bit of water there, because now what I can do is I can brush that color. So this is another way to create a blend. And as you can imagine, it's considerably less controlled than the other processes. But that lack of control is part of what kind of makes it interesting, just like in watercolor. Okay, and of course, then it means I got to stop for a second while that dries. But now it's doing some kind of interesting watery things back there and slightly out of focus, which is great for the background to be slightly out of focus. Okay, and then one of the other kind of corollaries to some of the ideas we've tossed around about fixing things and about when things are broken, when they're not. One of the ideas is that with every time you fix something, like I think it's much more interesting to have this little bit of shadow, so this darkness that falls through here, and for the dark shapes in the background to be both out of focus and not to be very descriptive. Like I'm not painting furniture back there, I'm not trying to describe a room or a particular space. It just is what it is back there. But if it was any more clear than it is, I think that it would start to be distracting. So there are some things like this edge, those where the paint is kind of thin and it just doesn't look thoughtful or well crafted. But I don't particularly care if everything lines up or is perfect, because like I said, I'm not perfect, you're not perfect, and I'm fine with that, right? I wasn't perfect this morning when I woke up, wasn't perfect last night when I went to bed, probably not gonna be perfect anytime soon. So not trying to make anything perfect. Just with each move that I make, I'm trying to thoughtfully make it better. I want to improve it, which is also what you're trying to do with your, it's kind of what an education is about, right? Is you're trying to intentionally better yourself, maybe the world, I would think. Like the world will be a better place because you're a better person in it. And you can do more. I guess that would be part of the description of what a better person is you can do more for the world with more skills and resources. So anything you do for your own brain, you're doing for Fresno. That's a very generous and kind thing of you. And I want you to feel like you'll have the chance to use all those cool skills as you gain them. So if you're interested in the various art opportunities around Fresno, I'm going to be posting part of our homework this week will be looking at an exhibition, an online exhibition by our curator. And once school starts back up in something like face-to-face. Okay, so I think that's more interesting now through the shadows. The light comes around the top. I'm going to have to mess with the light a little bit, but I think that's a much more interesting arrangement than it was before. And more contrasting, right? So a few hard and soft edges in this area, like in this area, pulls these two objects forward, right? In a lot of your still lives, I'm noticing that you've got like an object, an object, an object. Try to have overlap. The fact that these overlap and that this overlaps that this overlaps that they throw shadows on one another, but that's what we're talking about throughout all of the writings and information about still lives. The word I tried to use as often as possible is relationships. And that's because what you're trying to do is create relationships between things. It's part of, like, the real world part of this would be, way too bright. The real world part of this would be that, okay, better. That things affect each other, right? And that's not just you are affected by the world or the pandemic or fires or Armageddon in general, but that the world is affected by you. So when you have an object that reflects on another object, this throw shade, all of those phrases, throwing shade, illuminating, sharing the light, sharing the spotlight, hogging the spotlight, all of those kind of things, all of that stuff happens in a painting, right? There's a relationship that's suggested here. And I'm not saying that you need to, kind of go crazy, but if you look at Carol Marine's paintings and you look at the titles, some of them are quite funny because she's suggesting that these apples and cherries, kitchen knives and scissors and things they kind of have a secret life, and all she's doing is documenting it. That's kind of a Toy Story version of the world. And I'm all for it. I think that's great because I kind of live in a similarly Toy Storied world. I think that, like, I don't think my toys talk to each other at night. Okay, that's better, or more interesting anyway. And okay, and you also notice that I'm not diving into details. There's a stem on this apple. People paint the stem first thing, very first thing they do is jump in and paint the stem, and it's a detail. It's a small detail. Those I needed to paint because of where they were. This I don't need to paint until the very end, and even then it will be no big deal, right? So for one thing, don't make the details more important than they are, either by painting them too early or by enhancing their structure. A little suggestion of light, a little bit of, so painting shadows and shapes in a lighter color or a more subtle color is because smaller shapes simply don't have the weight to create a large amount of light, right? So small shapes, even when they're very bright, they're not as bright as bigger shapes. Okay, so what you'll see me doing is kind of moving subtly, kind of sneaking up on a color sometimes, which I can't say is it's always the best thing. Sometimes you just want to jump in and do it, but being willing to make 2 or 3 marks to get there, it allows for a greater range of subtleties. For some of you, subtlety may not be the goal right now, and I get that, and I respect that. But for me, a little bit of subtlety, so just a little tiny bit of darkening and lightening of things can be more powerful than if I just beat you over the head with it. So each one of those little moves that I've made, I think, has helped a bit. And I'm going to make this corner, I'm going to push that back just a little bit more because we talked about it when I was doing the move, making that move. Okay, is that part of what I'm trying to do is make that back edge less important. So nothing makes it less important than for it to be the same color as what's behind it. So when it just becomes lost, that is less important. So dragging a little bit of the gray from the table into the area around it makes that a less important edge, sort of softening the edge, okay? And anything that I do in the foreground, so if I want to make the foreground bolder, even the tiniest bit of darkening, then this edge pulls that edge forward. So you can see it's very subtle back here. I get a little bit closer to the apple and to this area, and I just want to make that indication a little bit bolder. Okay, so while these shadows set up, I'm going to mix and check my light colors. So I've got some white on the palette. I've got this near white. You can see the paint is starting to get kind of boogery, right? It's starting to get, I realize boogery is kind of a technical term, but so it's starting to get schmutz, which is just another word for booger. And that's really not my favorite texture. I think it's kind of gross. So, so usually what I do is just clean the palette off each time, but I'm gonna do a separate video on cleaning palettes, tools, everything like that, and I'm gonna let this go. I'm gonna let this become pretty much a mess so that I can get there. Okay, so talked about touching up the light side of things to increase contrast. So one of the things that you might not have noticed is just how much space I left. So there, the lights weren't that light. You can notice, I mean, that's much, much, much lighter and brighter. So, and that's not white. I pulled that from right here. So I've got a lot of room to make things brighter. That's important. So if you don't reserve the white, just like in watercolor, if I don't reserve the white, if I don't leave a little bit of space, then I have no paint to make highlights. So I need to have a little bit of white reserved. So the lightest light on here at this point is still nowhere near white. And so by just kind of taking another run at a couple of these shapes, especially if the paint was a little thin, and I felt the paint was a little thin through there. So if I'm not happy with a relationship, it's my painting. And like I said, I'm ultimately responsible for making it interesting. More than anything else, I'm responsible for making it interesting. Perfect is way out of my hands. Not going to be perfect. But it can be interesting. Okay, so by just making sure, if I re-examine anything that I'm questioning, anything that bothers me, this is the time to fix it. This line is a little too hard of a line, and it ignores some important stuff that's going on there. So I'm going to soften that line, and I'm going to darken the area back there, so you get a little bit more of a sense of glow about the edge of the bag. I didn't put a strong occlusion under this bag, but I think it needs that. So all that means is not black, but a darker gray. And you can't see it because of the angle that I'm working, so you're seeing the canvas, but I'm spending most of my time studying the palette and studying the reference. My attention is not on this. I'm not gazing fondly at my painting, because everything I need to make this good is in the reference image. So the time spent is spent looking at the reference image to make sure that I'm moving in the right direction and to make sure that I'm making something interesting. Making that a little bit more rounded. Okay, along the way I dribbled some paint in there. Happens, but it's just paint. So since I know that adding more paint only makes it more interesting, I'm just adding more paint. It's already better. So we talked about how the smaller areas, so a small area like this little shadow in here can't be that dark, it just can't. So it can be darker than the areas around it, but it's always a relative thing. So it's not dark, it's just darker. So when I said, you block in the big shapes, that gives you the information to start working toward the smaller shapes. Okay, now as this dries, I can look at those relationships a little better, and I can see that there is room to make this a little bit lighter. There, okay. Okay, and again, what I'm doing is I'm studying the reference studying the reference image pretty closely while I do this. It's not going to fix all of my problems, but if I'm interested in creating the relationships that are there, if those are what's inspiring me, and in a perceptual painting, it's kind of the conceit, is that we're interested in recreating the experience of looking. We have an interest in actually using our eyes and sharing the experience of looking with the viewer, and that as artists, we are looking carefully and closely. Okay, that's still not quite white, but pretty close. So you can see that there is a lot of room, so I can step on this a little bit. If you remember that, step on it means make it just a little darker. If you're not happy with a mark, just remake it. Especially as you get late into the painting and you get some boogers on your palette, that's kind of an unpleasant experience for me. Anyway, okay, so I'm going to look at this stem. I'm going to put the highlight on the stem first, because why not? It doesn't actually care. And like I said, it doesn't need to go very dark on the photo. It may appear to be very dark, but it's in relation to the colors around it that it's dark. So being subtle is usually a better plan. So I can make things darker than the forms around them, but I don't need to go very dark. So this is just a darker gray, because as it falls down into this area down here, it gets a little bit darker. And that's it. That's all you really need to do. So I could pick up a little bit more light on the other end, right? So in the shadow, it gets darker going this way, and on the other end, it gets a little lighter as it goes toward the end. But also part of the reason why it appears to be brighter out here, too bright maybe, is that it is simply bigger. I mean, there's just more mass. It's catching more light. So it doesn't have to be terribly dramatic. And I'm willing to put a little effort into it because these details make a difference, right? So I try to get the details right. It's not that they're not important. It's that I don't want to take care of it first. It's not more important than the other forms. Okay, but it does kind of put a cherry on top. It does make things look carefully done and carefully observed. There's a tiny bit more light that I could bring in right here. Which kind of turns that towards so that you make a visual connection there. I could make sure that this shadow follows the pattern of this. So probably needs to be a little further up like that. Okay, so since I'm working on details, clearly I'm about done here, and I think I'm just gonna call it. So for a study, for something like that, pretty much what I'm doing is spending about 15 minutes blocking it in, let it dry, make sure it's really thoroughly dry, then about half an hour. Again, I realize my timing is different than yours, but I'm just showing kind of proportionally about half an hour to an hour doing the painting, then letting it set up, letting me walk away from it, come back with fresh eyes, and then handling the details. I'm not just kind of plowing through each thing. And so that's the study. I'll take a still image of it, I'll compare it, and you can see where there are differences. I made the table darker in order to push that back. I made the background a little lighter, or in order to push it back. So what I'm trying to do, I've got a little bit more lightness, a little more darkness on this side. That helps to bring contrast here and to bring contrast to this flow, this line that's going across. So I want you to feel the light hitting here and flowing across the painting. I want you to feel that this apple is reflective. That's an important part of it. And I want you to feel that these bags are not perfect. So each one of those moves was important. And then notice what a strong unifying force this big dark shape and this dark shape is. So while you're working on this, I hope you have fun. Don't go crazy. Don't try to make it perfect, like I said. All right, have a good day.